Anyways, so I think they like the movie. So we have, I think, about half an hour for questions and answers. Do you guys want to kick off? Yeah. So, so the practical one here, why don't you come
say something really quickly, just before the questions kick off, is, you know, when this was all happening in June, the media was all over the place. They were obsessed with sort of me, what was going on, what the politics were about. But this wasn't about politics. This wasn't even really about surveillance. This was about democracy. This was about the fact that, you know, we collectively, as the public, both nationally and internationally, had the world that we lived in change without our knowledge, without our consent, without our awareness, without our involvement. Technologists, particularly the IETF, you guys are the ones who have, I think, really led the charge and started to show us that there's a path out of this. There's a way forward when these kind of things happen. Because, you know, when we think about the work of the IETF, when we think about the standard principles that we all work from, when we kind of try to envision what is the internet? To whom does it belong? Who does it work for? You know, the internet doesn't belong to vendors. The internet doesn't belong to governments. The internet belongs to the user, right? So when we think about things like the end-to-end principle, for example, you know, the idea of a simple core and smart edges, like that's what we planned for, that's what we wanted, that's what we expected. But what happened in secret over a very long period of time was that it was changed to a very dumb edge and a deadly core. And that's what's being changed now. And you guys have done it in your RFCs, the IEPs put out a couple draft statements about it. And this is what we see moving forward. We see an opportunity to change this. Because it's not about, you know, the United States. It's not about the NSA. It's not about the Russians. It's not about the Chinese. It's not about the British. It's not about any national government. It's about the world we have, the world we want to live in, and the internet, the connections that we want to build between people, between nodes, between every point of presence in every home, on every phone around the world. And I think if I were going to synthesize and kind of simplify for anybody who doesn't think about this stuff, who doesn't care about the politics, and I get it, because, you know, this isn't a political forum, it's very neutral, it's about the technology, is to go, you know, let's not demonize the NSA specifically, because they're one example of a global problem. The lesson of 2013 is not that the NSA is evil, it's that the path is dangerous. The network path is something that we need to help users get across safely. Our job as technologists, our job as engineers, our job as anybody who cares about the internet in any way, who has any kind of personal or commercial involvement, is literally to armor the user, to protect the user, and to make sure that they can get from one end of the path to the other safely and without interference. With that, can we get questions?
Sure. Ed, this is Daniel. I'm behind the camera right now. So I was wondering if you could share some insights about the sort of scale and scope of the machinery that's doing this kind of monitoring, and in terms of sort of protocol design, what sort of things we should be aware of in terms of the power of correlative attack and things like that.
It's a good question. It's a big question. And if I could ask other people who have questions, if they could speak from the mic that's actually in front of the laptop, so I'm not getting room audio, that would be really helpful because it's got a directional mic on it. When we think about scope, when we think about scale, when we think about what I saw as an analyst sitting in Hawaii, you know, working with X-keyscore, working with the tools of mass surveillance, you want to think that you know, the analyst, anybody who's doing this, they don't have to be an NSA or wherever, are the equivalent, you're T-sharking the image or wire sharking you don't like the command name. Every packet that sort of crosses through your points of presence, and the NSA once had a plan that they called the million points of presence. They kind of stopped when they got to about 100,000 and said, you know, it's good enough. We don't really need any more. But the idea is that you can start to store everything. You can start to buffer everything. Then you can select things. You can promote things. Everything that looks like it's related to something you're interested in. Whether it's the plain text of your email messages or, you know, your Yahoo chat, your Facebook chat before it was protected, or even after it's protected, if they're able to steal the keys from service providers and things like that, or compel revelation or some other mechanism. Things scale up in ways that when people are designing the protocols, they cannot anticipate. Typically, when we think, you know, as InfoSec people or security people, what the real threats are, you know, back in the day when talking about sort of somebody hunched on the backbone of the internet watching everybody all the time was screaming paranoia. You thought about somebody in a coffee shop. You thought about somebody on the local network. You thought about, you know, some kind of insider threat or some remote threat, somebody that exploited some equipment on your network, but not that every point you crossed is a problem. Unfortunately, we're seeing that that is the case. And so it becomes a question of how do you make sure that nothing is in plain text at any point, where people can derive information directly through observation, or they can peripherally gain information that basically works contrary to the interests of the user through inference, you know, even if it's encrypted. One of the big things that I think we're likely to see, not immediately, you know, not in 5 years, but 10 years, 20 years down the road, is as encryption becomes pervasive, which is the desired state, right? We need to be able to protect the confidentiality of users' communications from all points of presence at all times. We're likely to see governments, companies, basically everybody who sees some lever for increasing their own incentives, whether it's for a business purpose, a governance purpose, or whatever, to collect information about association. What IP pairs are common? When you think about, for example, if you look at Amazon.com, you know, book entries and things like that, one of the interesting things that they put on every book page is things called statistically improbable phrases, which normally refer to things that are unique to the author, something that the author put out themselves. Now, if content were encrypted, but for example, DNS requests were not, you could start to identify users by statistically improbable host name pairings, things that you don't see throughout the giant mass of your buffer associated with, you know, normal people. It's not who goes to Reddit. It's not who goes to Hacker News. It's who goes to Reddit, Hacker News, and then, you know, grandma's cookie site, because that's trafficked by a very small number of individuals. These are the kind of things that we need to anticipate, that we need to prepare for when we think about proposals like dprive and DANE and DNS. When you combine these things, what you're really doing is you're creating, you know, the next generation of DNS step by step. And that's what we need to do. We need to come together, think about the lessons that we've learned from the failures of old architecture, and build a new internet that will survive not just for the next 2 years, the next 3 years, but for the next 50 years, the next 100 years, the next generation.
Patrick Linsky from Cisco. Is anybody talking with you about possible returns to the U.S.?
Yeah, so this is something that I can't discuss publicly because, you know, it's a private thing going on with the Department of Justice and everything like that. I've made clear since 2013 that it's my intention, my desire to return, but the DOJ is really stuck on the basically point they don't want to provide guarantees of a fair trial. The act that I've been charged under is from 1918, I believe, the Espionage Act, which was intended to be used against basically saboteurs, infiltrators in society who were literally bombing rail lines. They were opening their gates to let enemy troops in and things like that. It was never used against whistleblowers who were basically working in concert with journalists in partnership, basically, to serve the public interest. And because of the way this act is structured, because of the way that it's basically an old act, it was an emergency act, it wasn't relegated to Congress, it provides no ability to make a public interest defense. You cannot mention to the jury at all what your motivations were, what your goals were, why you did it, how you went about what you do, how you mitigated harms, anything like that. You can basically make no defense at all. The government simply says classified information was passed to journalists, passed to anybody, and then you go directly to jail for basically the rest of your life. There were only 2 cases previously, well, actually 1 case prior to, I believe, the Obama administration, where this law had ever been used against someone working with journalists, and that was Daniel Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers case. In recent years, unfortunately, we've seen this happen again and again and again to people who were basically working precisely with journalists, because you don't really see a lot of actual spies anymore. You know, the thing back in the day of people selling out government secrets for money, for personal gain, that's really not something that, we don't have a big clash of ideologies in the world today that motivates that kind of thing, that we used to see, you know, back in the 30s and stuff like that. Normally, you see people working with journalists not to hurt the country, but to help the country. And unfortunately, the government feels somewhat exposed by this dynamic. And rather than try to pass new laws, rather than try to create some new mechanisms to sort of resolve that, to provide any kind of new protections or new structures by which to do this, they're basically trying to use a deterrent effect to say, look, we understand these are serious concerns. For example, in the United States, both the courts and the Congress have decided that the NSA's programs that were revealed in 2013 were unlawful, and they've ended them. But they say, even though you did a good thing there, we're still going to destroy you because it's most important to us to maintain the stability of the system of controlling access to information.
Thanks.
Mark Nunningham. So, I have a couple questions, but I have a 13-year-old son, and he really took away from the movie when you described how the internet used to be before surveillance. He was quite taken by that description because he hasn't experienced it. And I wonder, you know, what can we do? Those values are very much the core of the IETF to me. What can we do to preserve that? You talk a lot about end-to-end encryption, which we've taken on board. What else is there, both technically and as citizens, can we do?
One of the biggest challenges, I think, for sort of a free internet, for an open internet, a safe internet for the users, is that we have an ability to divorce ourselves from physical identity. Now, one of the primary vulnerabilities of users around the world in terms of their relationship to great powers, right? Whether that's their national government, whether that's foreign government, whether that's groups that don't like them very much, the fact that they can be de-anonymized for their thoughts and then some discriminatory action applied against them is very dangerous. I mean, it's a direct threat to their safety. But even if we're not talking about people who are radical and, you know, are likely to receive some direct action against them, there's the very soft discrimination of inclusive communities that happen, you know, when you're on Facebook, for example, if you're by true name, a 12-year-old's not really going to be able to have a conversation with a professional engineer. They're not going to be able to enter that community. They're going to be recognized as somebody who's an outsider, who's a child. They're not going to be taken seriously. It's quite different, you know, back when I was very young and engaged with the internet, and I think many of these people in the room were the same way, where people didn't know who you were. If you asked the question would be answered at face value. So the question becomes, how do we restore that balance to some extent? And I think one of the big things that we need to do is we need to get away from true name payments on the internet. The credit card payment system is one of the worst things that happen for the user in terms of being able to divorce the access from the identity. We need to think about how to develop systems that can tokenize identity or transfer identity. That can take the fact that they have paid for access or have some ability to access the system, they're an authenticated user in some way, and move away from this system of very targeted, very quantified identification of everyone who interacts with the system. We want to get away from globally unique identifiers or universally unique identifiers, and instead have at least mechanisms for, even if it's not the default, even if it's not the standard, globally common identifiers, a fingerprint that matches everyone on the system if they choose to use it. Basically, we need to divorce identity from persona in a lasting and enduring and reliable way for people who choose to be able to use it.
Thank you. I'll just ask one more very short technical question, hopefully. We're designing some systems that rely upon attackers staying passive. And my question is that a reasonable assumption to make with the systems we're talking about, or are they apt to go active?
No, they've already gone active. I mean, there's the quantum system that NSA uses. Anybody can search in the room, quantum hand, quantum insert, things like that. It's a whole suite of tools. And this is just the NSA, right? There's governments all around the world, criminal groups, malicious actors, who are developing the same toolkits or already have them, where they basically will identify an unencrypted traffic stream, and then they'll manipulate it from the network. They'll inject an iframe into it if it's malicious. They'll basically hijack the DNS request. They'll set up a race condition where they can respond before the actual authority responds to send you to a server that they control, things like that, in order to provide some sort of browser exploit, get on your box and do whatever they want from there. But there's a real question about where we start, right? We can't fix everything at once. We need to be able to basically armor everything in transit, because that makes things very difficult to manipulate. We need to provide some sort of proof that it hasn't been tampered with, whether that's through signatures or whatever. And then we need to think about how do we actually harden the endpoints? How do we get there? But it's a process. It's a standard. And of course, at IETF, you guys are above the wires, you're below the apps. So the endpoint is very difficult. That's really the hardest problem. But right now, the most dangerous problem is the path. It's the network path. The more middle boxes there are, the more attack surface there are, right? A lot of people are like, oh, middle boxes are the solution to security. Middle boxes are actually the problem for security. If you add a new firewall, if you add to attack, middle box vendors in the room, you guys just have to actually think about this. How does the adversary look at the path? The simplest path, and by that I mean the one which has the least complexity, the least attack surface, is the safest path. The simplest path is the safest path. And the idea here is when you add each of these steps, each of these layers of complexity, you're adding another point of presence that the NSA or whoever could go, let me add this to my box. I have an exploit for, a Juniper whatever, or whatever, any kind of appliance that you drop on the path is a potential vulnerability. So those should only be added when they absolutely cannot be avoided. And in general, we want to think about, again, making the path non-interfering. It's not necessarily a question of, nothing at all can be on the path. But we have to think about what is the user's intent. How do we fulfill the user's intent without observing or analyzing it in any inappropriate way or interfering with it at all, if possible?
Thanks. Just so you know, we've got about 6 more people lined up to ask questions.
Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, Ed. This is Niels de Noever. First, I'd like to thank you for your courageous work. And over the past years in the IETF community, there has been an increased interest in privacy, which has been accelerated by your courageous work. How one can think, for instance, on the statement on pervasive surveillance and the guidelines for privacy considerations, but do you think there could also be further work to protect other human rights on a protocol level, such as freedom of expression?
Yeah, this is very much a developing topic. It's a very important topic, and it's a big question, so I can't really get at it in depth. I spoke a little bit about identity. And this really speaks to, when we think about human rights on the internet, the ones that immediately come to everybody's mind are privacy and security, right? You can add confidentiality in there as a part of privacy. And the idea is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the U.S. Constitution, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, All of these frameworks that say what human rights are, they all say we have to be protected against arbitrary interference at any kind of scale, anything untargeted, anything unjustified in our communications. Unfortunately, the internet has in many ways provided a very cheap and effective means of interfering with those rights. So yes, everybody knows about that, right? But we need to think about, when we think about identity, when we think about these other things, we need to think about other human rights principles, which are very difficult to enforce through national mechanisms, right? We can pass the best human rights laws in the world, in the United States, in the European Union, in Canada, whatever. It's not going to help people in Russia, in China, in Brazil, anywhere else. But if we create a fabric, if we create a network through protocols that provide means of access that can be guaranteed, that say the internet that you get in France is just as good as the internet that you connect to from China, that's a net win for human rights. When we think about access, we also need to think about things like non-discrimination. And again, how do you enforce non-discrimination, something like that, to a protocol level? It's, you know, it seems like it's very difficult. But then when you think about, well, what are the mechanisms through which discrimination occurs in the human rights context? And that's through affiliation, through association, again, through identity, by anonymizing people, by allowing them to divorce themselves from their physical identity, whether they're a member of a minority group, an aggrieved religious group, or something like that. They have a political affiliation that could get them jailed or killed in their country. If you allow them to divorce themselves through that, through the technology, you are providing human rights ahead of the law that the law will eventually recognize and support. And this is something that I think people do not realize yet. You know, thinkers do, a lot of technologists do, but the broad public doesn't really think about the progress of human rights in the historic context. Nobody was thinking, you know, about the speech rights of somebody when they were living in caves and running from tigers. That doesn't mean that human rights, you know, don't exist. It means that they are a product of civilizational progress. And we, in the technological community, are the vanguard of that progress today. We can provide new and enduring human rights that generations of people will enjoy. And that will be a net gain for humanity as a family. But even if we don't go that far, I think we have not just the right, but the duty to ensure that the human rights that we ourselves inherited will be passed along to those that come behind us. And we can use technology as the mechanism to achieve that.
Thank you.
Hi, first of all, I'm sad for the state of US law. Sorry. But I would like to ask one technological/philosophical question. You mentioned DNSSEC, and of course it makes some attacks harder because, well, it would allow us to eliminate some plaintext and so on the wire. But on the other hand, it basically centralizes everything on one place, which, if we consider such powerful adversary as we know we have, may be problematic. Of course, well, I'm interested in your thoughts about that because I don't see clear path from this situation. But at the same time, I'm DNSSEC promoter and implementer, so now I have personal problem with that because on one hand it eliminates some plaintext on the wire, but on the other hand, it may just add a false sense of security because we will think that it's secure, but they will know that it's not. So what's your thought about it?
So I agree with you. I mean, this is what's important about the IETF. Just because I say it doesn't mean it's gospel. I can be wrong about an incredible amount of things. Nobody should trust me. Nobody should grant any sort of outsized weight to what I say. When I talk about DNSSEC, I mentioned it in correlation with DANE and the DPRIVE initiative as well, because the whole idea is that, yes, providing some mechanism for sort of authentication of the responses to DNS queries is valuable. It's not an end to itself. You know, we still have to be able to say, well, all right, the certificate that you're getting from it for a server is also reliable. And then we have to actually be able to armor the requests themselves to make sure that they don't become a new vector, that they don't become manipulated. Who knows, like if eventually the DNS responses themselves that are provided through this become some sort of vulnerability because of the way they're parsed or whatever. But the whole idea is that we've got to start somewhere. And then we've got to iterate from that point. We've got to begin building. And when I think about things like DNSSEC, I don't think, it's the golden age, it will solve all of the problems. But I do think that it's a starting point. It's better than the status quo. It's better than what we have today. And by getting the community thinking, by coming together and trying to develop some kind of solution, some kind of standard, we can start developing things that will allow us to build a bridge to the next generation of what we need to protect us against the next generation of coming attacks. And there's a lot of things that get in there. I mean, cryptographic agility is one of the other big hot points that we have to deal with this day. That's from everybody.
Thank you very much. So let's implement it.
Thank you.
Hi, Joe Hildebrand. So when we're doing security work here, we often hear pushback on having default secure kinds of modes because of things like corporate networks where the corporation owns the network, they own the computer, and so they feel like they are justified in doing digital loss prevention sorts of things. Those kinds of requirements act as a ratchet down on the security of the kinds of things that we can build. I'm wondering if you've thought at all about ways that we can do requirements analysis that would help us sort of set the ratchet the other direction.
So one of the biggest things here, and I think this is really the central point, is it comes back to, again, who does the internet belong to, who does it serve, who is the IETF's ultimate customer? And the corporations, they have significant influence, vendors have significant influence because they're part of it. They're not an enemy, they serve, they make valuable contributions. But we need to be careful about granting them outsized influence, particularly when they have alternate means, other mechanisms of achieving their goals. When we think about things like DLP, data loss prevention, and whatnot, on the network, and the relationship of that to things like security of basic protocols, you have to go, all right, well, the benefit that the vendors, that the corporate customers, that the enterprise gains in convenience from having a less secure protocol is being paid for at a cost that's a threat to safety to users around the world. Which one of these needs to be weighed heavily? And I think it's not too much of an ask to recognize that the user at scale, the internet as a body, has a greater interest in security than the enterprise has in convenience, because the user cannot necessarily mitigate their circumstances. They lack in resources, they lack in capability, they lack in technological sophistication to protect themselves. However, the enterprise has root on all of their endpoints. If they want to implement any kind of DLP solution, they can do so. They can run their own homegrown system, they can implement a commercial system, they can put out their own certificate authority, they can do whatever they want because they have root on all the systems. It's just like when you're thinking about the NSA, they've got the Tailored Access Operations Office. These are the hackers, right? These are the guys who go and get root on the boxes that we say, I want to know what that guy's doing, get root. And whether they mail an exploit, whether they pop them as, they inject something in the network traffic stream, whatever, they get root. And then no matter what kind of personal security products that person's using, no matter what kind of encryption they're using, it doesn't help them because the NSA is now their systems administrator. The enterprise is their own systems administrator. They can handle these through alternative mechanisms that don't have the same costs for the global. That would be my opinion.
I think that's a useful construction. Thank you.
So we've been going for about a half an hour. I know you might be time constrained.
Let's extend a little bit longer. If we can, I got about 10 more minutes. Awesome. If that's okay with you?
That's just fine. We've got people willing to talk.
Hi, I'm Kiriti Kampala. What scared me most about the documentary and some of the comments you're making since, even right now, is not the data, and we can encrypt that, but the metadata and the correlation. So the fact that I'm talking to you now is going to get you in real trouble. You know that.
Probably. I just moved a couple steps up on the list through the association.
Exactly. So the question for you is, the first example you gave was, the credit card being so dangerous. What do you think about things like, you talk about, you can anonymize the endpoint, but then I'm talking to you, and then how do I know I'm talking to you, and how do we have a meaningful conversation without the NSA knowing who's talking to whom? But the big thing might be follow the money. So what about Bitcoin or things like Bitcoin that says at least the monetary transactions get anonymized? When, the question.
So the Bitcoin thing is, nobody really likes to talk about Bitcoin anymore. There are important concepts there. Obviously, Bitcoin by itself is flawed. The protocol has a lot of weaknesses in transaction size, in a lot of weaknesses that structurally make it vulnerable to people who are trying to control 50% of the network and so on and so forth. But when we think about the basic principles behind it, there are some very interesting things there, particularly when we start to combine them with that idea before of tokenization, of concepts like proof of work. Are there other means through which people can basically pay for access other than direct transfers of currency that originated with an association to their true name? The other ones are through mixed payment networks, for example, where you would have multiple steps, just like Tor, where they've got these mixers in sort of the Bitcoin universe, where they tumble the transactions and the Bitcoins that go in to pay for your purchase aren't the same Bitcoins that go out. But focusing too much on Bitcoin, I think, is a mistake. The real solution is, again, how do we get to a point where you don't have to have a direct link between your identity all of the time? You have personas. You have tokens that authenticate each personas. And when you want to be able to interact with people as your persona in your true name, you can do so. When you want to be able to switch to a persona, a common persona, an anonymous persona, a shared persona, you can do that. When you want to move to a pseudonymous persona, you can do that. Now, a lot of these are difficult problems, particularly when we talk about in the metadata context, the signaling context, and there are actually some really bad proposals. I think, and this is no offense to anybody who works on these particular problem spaces, but again, if it gets back to sort of middle depth space, we've got proposals like SPUD, for example, where they want to make UDP a new channel for leaking metadata about the user's intention. They want to do that. I get the feeling that there are a lot of people in the audience who are concerned about middle boxes. I didn't know that this was. All right. So the idea here is we can all understand the incentives of these vendors. They want to be able to provide mechanisms for tiered pricing. They want to be able to provide prioritized service for increased rates. They want to be able to say, whatever, we'll kick you down a tier and we'll charge you less. And these things are great, but again, those are their incentives, right? Those are not the internet's problem set. Those are the vendors' problem sets. And when we think about things like they talk about, all right, well, we want to be able to innovate in the protocol space. So do we. So does everybody, right? This isn't a thing where the vendor is against the IETF, the vendor is against the technical community, the academic community, whatever. We're all partners here. But we need to think about where the actual problems of this ossification originate from in the protocol space. And it's actually not from the IETF. It's from internet access providers. It's from network service providers. It's from level 3 Hurricane Electric, people in the middle, people running middle boxes, setting their firewall settings to a point where basically there's no space for innovation because they go, oh, well, we don't recognize it. It must be malicious. And they don't update it. They don't basically tend to the garden that we are all collaborating on. And so the question becomes, how do we provide new mechanisms? How do we create new incentives for everybody to work together here? And I think the first is to recognize when it comes to the global security problem that we have with internet communications today, we have to recognize that when new proposals are being put forward, we have to go, does this create more problems than it solves? And if it's creating more metadata that's associated with user preference, that could be intercepted, that could be manipulated, that could be ejected as a stream, this is in general a very bad thing. We need to be reducing the amount of metadata that's leaked on the part of a user's communications and visible to them, not increasing. And in general, I think we need to get to the point of intent. What is the user's intent as they interact with the internet, as they interact with their community, as they interact with the associations that they're having with their friends, their connections, whatever? And how do we ensure that our standards, our protocols, our technology, the systems that surround us every day are working to support, to protect, and to armor the user's intent, rather than to betray it or to monetize it or to take advantage of it in some way that might not be the end of the world, it might not be the worst thing in the universe, but it was not compliant with the user's actual intention as they engage. That if we want to provide those mechanisms, that's fine, but in general, they should be transparent, they should be opt-in, they shouldn't be things that we're baking into protocols, particularly when there's no proven problem that there's not another mechanism like simply changing the firewall settings to resolve.
Thank you.
Let's actually take another question.
Okay, this is Lee Howard. I'll give you choice 3 questions. You can decide which one to answer. I was going to do that anyway. First question was going to be, is there any government in the world that has the surveillance or intelligence gathering regulatory framework right? Second one was, Bruce Schneier gave us some very specific assignments at the IETF. Here's what you guys need to go do. Is there anything that we should specifically work on? And the third one is, I work at a large US ISP. What can I do? What should we be doing?
Those are good questions. We need another half hour for that. The US ISP is a good one. I would actually say that you're better informed to answer that than we are. Because the reality is a lot of people who work in the political spaces of these programs, the political contexts of them, or the academic contexts, we can understand the academic or practical realities of these problems in the security context, in the user context, in the political context, but we don't have the data on the practical context. We don't know what the actual cost is of, for example, losing middle boxes or putting in middle boxes, all of that stuff that everybody in the room really hates right now, for example, that we've seen. If you could help us understand that a little bit better, that would be valuable. Because it would allow us to have sort of a more nuanced conversation. But I don't want to get too into that because, again, I think it's pretty well established that everybody in the room has their own views on middle boxes that are probably a lot more developed than my own. But you mentioned, Bruce Schneier and sort of marching orders. When I think about the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years of the internet, and particularly when we think about the encrypted space, I don't know if anybody in the room is from the CFRG, but if we've got crypto forum groups in the room. By the way, the CrypTech project is awesome. I love what you guys are doing. I hope to see more of that. But the CFRG specifically, elliptic curves is the big thing everybody's talking about now. That's important work. That's valuable work. But something that I don't see a lot of this being done, and I'm not up on the literature, I'm not a university, so I can just be totally off on this, is actually quantum-resistant cryptography. We need to be able to start moving away from algorithms, at least in the asymmetric space, that are reliant on straight factorization or discrete log problems. Because when you think about the reality of encrypted blocks of data, right, when you've got ciphertext out there, when we think about ephemeral communications, right, if they got perfect forward secrecy or whatever, that's one thing. When we think about people collecting everything off the lines, when we think about people being able to collect everything from service providers, long-lived data sets, the problem looks very different. When we have, for example, encrypted blobs that have been exfiltrated through one means or another, they've been copied, they've been stolen, but they can't be broken today, they'll still be on disk in 10 years. And we need to have algorithms standardized, because God knows how long it takes to actually adopt these things and get them in front of the users, get them being used by default, that will be able to basically survive quantum cryptanalysis. And I would say that is probably the most important problem that I don't see getting a lot of press, that I don't see getting a lot of attention. Thank you.
So, how are you doing on time?
I think we can take one more, actually, and I'm going to have to call that for
Alan Johnson. Mr. Snowden, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. It's really an honor to have you here. A lot of us are concerned about man-in-the-middle attacks on the protocols that we design. You know, it's great encrypting your traffic, but if you encrypt it right to your right to an attacker, then that's not so good from a privacy perspective. And we're looking at techniques for doing it, for example, for protocols and technologies like WebRTC that we're using right now to communicate, and doing it in ways that don't involve third parties or middle boxes, if you like. I just wondered if you had any advice for us on, you know, whether we should be trying to solve this problem and, you know, what we should be doing about it.
So that's a hard one for me to get to, because it's not really my central point of expertise. Normally when I think about, how do you authenticate that you're not being man-in-the-middle, I think actually traditional tradecraft terms, I think of out-of-band, authentication. But of course, that doesn't work. Nobody's going to be scanning QR codes in real life. Nobody's going to be able to, nobody's just as a fact of their working process going to be using challenge responses and whatnot, even though they should, even though that's the best practice. We do need better means of doing this. Unfortunately, I don't know of anybody who has a better solution, but it is, if somebody can develop it, and want to go get the equivalent of the Nobel Prize from the Snowden committee, if you can, because it's important. But there is something that this touches on more broadly when we think about man-in-the-middle, and I know this has been controversial recently, which is people think about actually the subversion of the standardization process itself. We think about NIST, we think about dual EC, DRBG, we think about the recent allegations that have been made about community members, people who are associated with the NSA and things like that. And these are real concerns. At the same time, I think we have to be really careful about basically slinging mud on people without evidence. Just like we've got a presumption of innocence, in the courts, we should have that in the community as well. We do have to be careful, we do have to be suspicious, but we should really evaluate people on the basis of their work, as opposed to, whisper campaigns and things like that. I can tell you as a reality, I worked at the CIA before I worked at the NSA, right? I worked at the NSA as well. I have seen actual operations where the CIA has sent human agents into organizations overseas, big, organizations, not standard organizations specifically, but big infrastructure companies, because they wanted to be able to penetrate them. And the idea that you can have sort of a mole in your organization is terrifying. At the same time, I know from this kind of experience that if you think the guy working on sort of your standards process who's sitting right next to you is sort of this evil mustache-twirling villain who's trying to destroy everything and he's laughing as soon as he leaves the session, it doesn't work like that. The NSA is not going to tell the guy who's sitting on the standards forum with you that, all right, we need to push this change because it's going to weaken encryption here. We're going to be able to own everybody because of it, and you'll have destroyed internet security. We'll all laugh about it. It's great. These are people who are basically doing bad things for good reasons. They're trying to keep people safe the best they know how. Now, you can argue about intentions and everything like that, and that's fair. You can say it doesn't matter what their intention is, the ends don't justify the means, and I would agree with that. But at the same time, when you think about how this would work, the NSA is not going to want some guy sitting in an IETF meeting to slip up to say the wrong thing and reveal something about their quantum cryptanalysis capabilities. Instead, they're simply going to tell this person, look, you're on this forum, you need to steer them away from this because this is insecure, even if in reality that's actually very secure. And you need to steer it to this because it is secure, even if in reality it's actually backdoor. So we need to take some of the fear out of the community and instead focus on vetting anything to the best of our ability and recognizing that, look, when we're dealing with top-level adversaries, when we're dealing with people who have nearly infinite resources, they're going to be able to interfere with processes through one means or another. They're going to be able to find some method of subversion, some method for access, because because that's what they do. They're going to be there tomorrow, they're going to be the next day, and they're all around the world. Every organization is doing this. The real way to defend against that is to focus on the principles, focus on basically enabling the user's intent, focusing on protecting against all costs. Don't carve out exceptions. Don't. When people talk about lawful access and things like that, you need to think about, well, what happens when China knocks on the door and asks for the same thing? And basically vet things as best you can. If there's someone who appears to be suspicious or making suspicious contributions involved in a working group, don't necessarily say this person's an enemy agent or something like that. Simply scrutinize the work and find the weaknesses in it, if at all possible. That's the best we can do, and that's the only way that we can still be an open and inclusive community that's not basically trying to saw our arms off because we're afraid somebody might be compromised.
We have a couple more people lined up, but I'm sensing that it's getting late for you.
Yeah, it's pretty late. But all right, let's take one last one. Yeah. So this wireless is one of the biggest, most important, most difficult problem spaces to resolve because again, it gets back to the same thing of we don't want domain conflicts when it comes to addresses, like MAC addresses and stuff like that. I'm not sure that the system that we use today is actually the best system. This whole thing about we've got burned in, globally unique hardware addresses. These identifiers are extremely dangerous. If you look at, if you go to your search and search for NSA and shenanigans, the program is literally called shenanigans. They set up an airplane that basically had a big stingray on the bottom of it that just listens for all of the ARPs, all of the basically wireless squawking from everything that's on the RF spectrum out in the wild, and they would fly orbits over cities. Now, this initially started in the war zones. They were doing it in Yemen and places like that because they were looking for particular handsets, and then they were aiming missiles at them. They were literally, when we talk about the metadata problem here, we've got the director of the National Security Agency, former director, Michael Hayden, who said, we kill people based on metadata. And he's not lying. We don't know who's holding the phone at the time we launched the missile. We just know, hey, look, that's the IMSI, that's the IMEI pair. Let's send something at it and see what we get. And that's how wedding plans get hit. At the same time, legitimate targets get hit by this occasionally too. One would probably say more often than not, one would hope more often than not. But that's the reality of that. So the question becomes, how do we resolve that? How do we fix that? Is there any other way of doing this? And the question becomes, is there some way that we can survive having, for example, domain conflicts in the MAC space or any other kind of global addressing space and deconflict those in software? Deconflict those in some kind of identity space that the user can change. Some key material that they have where they go, all right, whatever I did with my phone last night when I called my girlfriend, I want to change that because of whatever. Or I'm going to a political rally. I don't want the local police to know that my handset was at this protest because I don't want to end up on a list. I don't want my door to be knocked on later on. And then I'll roll back to my identity as soon as I'm finished with the protest. These things are things that should be exposed to the user because here's the problem. When we think about launching, drone strikes at actual terrorists, people who are making bombs, planning to place bombs in civilian areas to actually kill people, we want to have effective means of preventing that. We want to be able to save lives. We want to be able to keep people safe. But the problem is, this shenanigans program is now being used in the United States by the U.S. Marshals Service, by the FBI under a different name, where they're trying to find these same cell phone handset IDs for common criminals. There's a trickle-down problem when it comes to the development of intelligence programs, where these agencies that have extraordinary resources, extraordinary capabilities, these resources get funneled into new capabilities to subvert the global infrastructure that we all rely upon. But then eventually, the government becomes very accustomed to using these capabilities in one problem space. The people who developed that solution then move to a different agency. They then move to a different area. They start to cross-pollinate government agencies. They may move internationally. They may leave, create a private company that commercializes these products and things like that. And suddenly, we see things that were used in very narrow circumstances, when there was literally no alternate mechanism for addressing sort of what they would claim as a legitimate governmental need or intervention, is suddenly being used against everybody in their daily lives as a matter of course. If the idea of an airplane circling a city that's manned, that has a limited flight time, that's basically figuring out what building every handset lives in, and then associating what other handsets spend the night in that building with them, scares you. Think about 20 years from now when there are drones that are powered by solar and are in a persistent orbit doing this 24/7 over every major point of presence. So even if you're not connected to the internet, they can see that your handset ID, that the MAC address on your MacBook or your iPhone or whatever has moved from city A to city B, country C to conference D. These are not things that are crazy. These are not things that are screamingly paranoid. These are obvious solutions that are being developed today because they are cheap and they are easy. This is something you don't even need a grad student to do. This is something a couple bright undergraduates could do in a couple months. And if we can do it that simply, minus the whole persistent flight thing, think about what somebody with $75 billion a year to spend on this stuff can do. And that's the combined intelligence budget of the United States intelligence community per year, including military spending. So we really have to figure out not what the problems are today, but how do we fix things on an enduring basis for the future? How do we basically anticipate where things are likely to go and to resolve things on the infrastructural level, on the fundamental level, to go, look, we don't want to put ourselves in a position where we are vulnerable to abuse. And that's the reality of today. We've got governments in the United Kingdom that are saying we want to be able to ban encryption, or okay, maybe banning encryption is unreasonable. We're going to demand that service providers backdoor their encryption. We're going to say if you want to sell a device here, you have to be able to provide key material to us. We want to basically weaken security standards in this nation or that nation or this jurisdiction or whatever jurisdiction. The reality is the United Kingdom does not own the internet. The United States does not own the internet. The public owns the internet. They are our customer. And the way we solve this, the way we protect this, the way we protect the global constituency of users that we represent is to make everybody safe all of the time. Otherwise, we're trying to pick good guys and bad guys, and we're making ourselves vulnerable to changes in government of good guys. They might be the most enlightened people in the world today, but they might not be in 5 years, in 10 years. And the only safe political principle for dealing with that is to focus on safety first. Don't make compromises when it comes to your rights. The only rights that anybody enjoys in any country in the world, in any time or any place, are not the rights that you say exist. They're not the rights that you believe in, but they're the rights that you stand up for, you assert, and you defend. And I think that's what we should do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So this is the last question. Can we pose a question?
All right, I'm going to have to keep this one short for real, but all right.
Really short.
Really short. Monica, I'm a journalist. I have a long list of questions, but I picked one for you. So high-tech is likely always going to be a domain where few experts will have the knowledge to understand and control the system. Could it be that the use of high-tech fundamentally undermines democratic society? Or can we hope to do something to educate users or whatsoever?
I think actually the IETF is a great example of why that's not the threat that people might be concerned about. There are contexts, there are circumstances where people could think about that, and that's a real danger to sort of the standard control of governments. However, when you look at the IETF, they literally don't make a decision unless it's based on consensus. There are no requirements, there are no academic standards or qualifications that anybody has to meet before they can be involved in the working group. Literally anyone can join, anyone can participate in the process, anyone can make themselves heard, anyone can influence the standards that are being developed, put forth, and decided. I would say that the direction of the Internet's future on a policy basis, how the technology is going to work, and the kind of Internet that we will all enjoy, the technology that we will all rely upon in the future, is a more open system today than it ever has been in the past. It's a more inclusive community than it ever has been before. And the reality is, if the Internet and technology does become a danger to us in the future, it's our own fault because we decided not to participate and left it to other groups and other influences to decide for us rather than being a part of it and shaping it with our hands. Thank you. I really got to jump.